just so you know, Laetitia is in the process of writing her PhD, so it's very nice of her to be here with us today. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm gonna submit the manuscript on Monday. So I was about to say, yeah, nice to meet you, all of you. I'm a PhD student at Toulouse, at University of Toulouse, but actually I'm finishing the PhD. And to give you a bit of context, my background is in design. So before the thesis, I was a user experience designer. And I had the chance to meet David and Jacques at ICT Forest 2023. And we presented this paper at ICT Forest 2024. So because of our backgrounds, it's at the crossroads of ICT, HCI, management and design. And it grew out of discussions between us three about the avoided emissions calculation. So maybe we can move on to the. Okay, perfect. So to begin with, I'm going to explain a bit the title. So for those who may not know, avoided impacts are calculation methods for estimating the difference between the impact of a scenario in which a given solution is implemented and a reference scenario in which the solution is not implemented. So most avoided impact methods claim to be able to support environmental decision making. But in our discussions, we were concerned that these methods may be somehow too reductive to capture the complexity of environmental decision making, especially when it comes to identify levers for action and not just claiming if a solution is good or not. So this is why we investigated the following questions. Are these methods appropriate to environmental decision making? And what alternative approaches could enhance decision making support?
So the first thing that we did during the creation of the paper was a literature review of the most recent net environmental impact accounting framework. I think most of you, or maybe some of you, know some of those methods. There are some of them who come from France with Quanti-GES, Empreinte Projet, and the Net Zero Initiative, which are both from ADEME and Carbon 4. But there is also a lot of methods that come from European and mondial mondial institution. What is very interesting is that in each of those methods, we have highlighted that there was at least one decision-making objective that was supposed to be addressed by those methods. This could be try to help the consumer to choose between a product or another one, or it could be for a politician. It could also be for the people financing the solution, or also for the designer who were designing the solution. Each of them cover different type of decision-making purposes, but all of them are supposed to address those. This is why we wanted really to target on this specific issue of decision-making. And then we also did a case study on Vinted, avoided emission. So for those who don't know Vinted, this is a second-hand resale platform where seller and buyer can meet and exchange second-hand products. It's mostly clothes that is sold on the platform, but it can also be other stuff. And they publish with Value, which is a consulting firm. In 2021, they publish this report, which is called Vinted Climate Change Impact Report, and which state that on average, each transaction on the platform had avoided in 2021 1.8 kilograms CO2 equivalent. We use this study not as a way to point out the main failure of Vinted, or not as a way to shame Vinted, but more as a way to illustrate both the criticism that we develop in the paper and also to present maybe the alternative that could have been done or that could have been conducted by Vinted. And this study is very interesting because it's pretty good quality. I mean, it's very transparent. It really explains what it is it doing. So it's not a specific study that need to be shamed, but it's really showing the inherent issues that are brought by net environmental impact accounting. We believe the inherent limitation. So the first challenge that we develop in the paper is concern uncertainties. So what we state is that net impact methods are insufficiently acknowledging quantifiable and unquantifiable uncertainties. So what do we mean by that? The goal of net environmental impact is to see when you deploy a service, in our case, a digital service, you want to see if the deployment of the solution will result in a net avoided impact, which would be above this line, or a net additional impact. And when you want to do this, the first thing that you will do is to assess what we call the direct impact of the solution, which is the impact of all the resources that are directly needed to fulfill the service provided by your digital service. This can be, in the case of Vinted, the server that are used by Vinted, the the smartphones that are used by the users, but also the deliveries or maybe the trucks that are used for delivering the parcels. And this, of course, is only positive impact. And this has some uncertainties because it is inherent to the exercise of environmental accounting. When you want to do environmental accounting, there is some uncertainties that are there and that can be reduced, but they will be still uncertainties. And then you want to assess the enablement impact. So the enablement impact are what we could often call the positive effect of the solution. Is what your solution is doing. It's usually substitution and or optimization. And when you want to assess the volume of positive impact that are bring by the substitution and optimization effect, you want to do it in comparison with a reference scenario. So you have to ask yourself what would have happened without the solution. And this is the difference between those two scenarios that will give you the volume of enablement impact. But this, of course, is very uncertain to determine what would have happened without the solution. You never know. So this brings an additional layer of uncertainty. And then you want to assess other indirect effects, such as the rebound effect, for those who knows, which we introduce even more uncertainty due to the uncertain interaction between the solution and the socio-technical system that you are analyzing. So in some cases, and maybe in most of the cases, you will be in a situation like you see here in the graph, where you cannot know due to the uncertainty if the deployment of solution will result in a net positive or a net negative environmental impact, which make the figure of the net environmental impact figure as a unique result not really suited for doing decision. Because if you're a decision maker, we just give you the figure. What do? Do you deploy it or you don't deploy it? Well, with the uncertainty, you don't really know what you should do. And then there is also another problem is that most of the net environmental impact methods, they recommend to assess the uncertainty, even though no one does. Like in no study, there is an uncertainty, a quantitative uncertainty analysis, because it's very, very difficult to do it. But they recommend to do it. But they recommend it to do it as a risk analysis, which is trying to identify the probability of a net impact result to deviate from reality. But this is a problem because there are many sources of uncertainty that doesn't fit into a quantitative framework or into a probabilistic approach. For example, we can mention the unquantifiable social impact of the drop in donation to charities that is induced by Vinted. This is well documented. Since Vinted have been widely used, there is fewer donation to charities because people sell it rather to donate their clothes. But also we can mention the emerging phenomena that you cannot anticipate, and so you cannot put a quantitative uncertainty on emerging phenomena. So this is why the uncertainty make it very difficult to use the net impact figure as a way to decide. Another challenge that we highlight is related to complexity. So what we say is that even though we're in a context of complex, very complex system, the net impact method, they are very reductionist and solution oriented. So if we take the case of Vinted, for instance, so we know that Vinted, the purpose of Vinted or the environmental purposes of Vinted is to replace the purchase of new products. And those purchases, they are really embedded into several systems such as donation, closing, digitization, the values. And so when you introduce Vinted into those systems, this will give rise to very complex socio-technical dynamics. But instead of being based on a really in-depth analysis of the problem that Vinted is trying or the problem that the solution you are assessing is trying to resolve, well, the net impact method, they really start with an analysis of the solution. For example, in the case of Vinted, there is in the study there is nothing about the dynamic that is responsible for the unsustainability of the textile sector they're trying to improve. So how can they really analyze how Vinted or the environmental effect of Vinted if they don't really assess or try to understand why there is a problem? So when we're generally faced with high level of uncertainty and complexity, net impact method, they suggest a very reductionist representation of the result, which is the net impact figure. In the case of Vinted, it is the figure that is representing the avoided emission, 1.8 kilogram. And in this context, we align with an author, which is called Sterling, which said that when knowledge is uncertain, the expert, like us around the table, should avoid pressure to simplify their advice, which net impact method suggests. And they should render decision maker accountable for the decision by showing them the complexity and not try to reduce it too much and showing them the uncertainty. It is to be mentioned that some of the method, they also bring additional representation of results, for example, with consequence graph, which is a way to represent the effect of a solution. So some of the method they suggest to also communicate this type of result in addition to the net impact figure. And a consequence graph is basically seeing you put a solution and then you represent the cause consequences link or dynamics that is induced by the solution. There are still two problems with the consequence graph. The first problem is that it is still centered around the solution. So the consequence graph begin by the solution, and it does not really address why the solution is there, what are the dynamic behind the deployment of the solution. So it is like there was nothing before the solution, and the solution is emerging from nothing. And also in a consequence graph, you cannot model feedback loops, which I think Laetitia is going to talk a little bit more after. There is also another issue which relate to what we call inspiring. We think that net impact methods are really more appropriate for claiming avoided impact than for exploring decision compatible with an environmental transition scenario. So in our understanding of decision making, a method that is supposed to help decision making should encourage decision maker to take the best decisions. And to take the best decision, you need to explore a decision space, which means all the decisions that could be taken. It is quite striking to note that the method give no guidelines on how to construct a decision space. In the case of Vinted, there is, for instance, no recommendation in the report. There is no recommendation on what the designer or the consumer should do to reduce or to maximize the overall impact, which really make us believe that those methods are more made for claiming than for deciding. In addition, the fact of claiming that a solution has positive impact does not guarantee that the solution is compatible with with an environmental transition scenario. Because when you achieve your transition objective, this can have two consequences on avoided emission. The first consequence is that it would reduce the imagined positive effect of a solution. I will give an example. In the case of Vinted, imagine a state decide to invest in the eco-design of clothing and to adopt a policy in favor of limiting the number of clothing per person. Well, the reference scenario will be, the impact of the reference scenario will be very lower because you will have a more eco-friendly way of dealing with your clothes. So it means that the positive effect of Vinted is lowering. So the more you achieve transition, objective, the less the digital solution is interesting. And another consequences of achieving transition objective is that it can make the solution that you are assessing incompatible with other measures taken. In the case of Vinted, for instance, if the state were to impose quotas on parcel delivery on the transport of goods, this will of course make the continuity of Vinted service more difficult, if not impossible. And here's a very important principle that we can draw on those consideration, is that the aggregation of individual avoided emission does not constitute a transition scenarios. This means you don't, the fact of looking at different solution on the market, trying to aggregate those avoided emission to constitute a transition scenarios will not work, because those solutions might be incompatible or might be not relevant depending on what transition scenario you want to fulfill. This really is a very liberal way of seeing the transition, as let the company present their solution, and let's aggregate maybe the activity of all those companies, and this will constitute a transition through market dynamics. The last thing, I'm not going to extend on that, but we also argue in the paper, and I want you to read the paper if you want to fully understand what we're developing. We argue that the safeguards that are proposed by net impact methods, because they are really safeguards on to avoid greenwashing, they only focus on the subjectivity of the stakeholders that are conducting the analysis. No, they're not. Excuse me. They are not focused on the subjectivity of the stakeholders. It is like if one person and another one conduct the study, it will bring the same result, which of course is not the case, because it's dependent on many things: the values, the knowledge, the interest, the power. And so they not focusing on the stakeholder conducting the study, which in our opinion could increase the risk of using those methods as a way to do greenwashing. Laetitia, I let you the floor.
Yes. Okay, so to tackle these challenges, we search for alternative or more complementary tools and methods in systemic approaches. So systemic approaches, it's a bit of a mess, but you have systems thinking and systemic design, which were sources of inspiration to us. And it's a whole ecosystem. So you have also future studies and so on. Again, if you want more information, you can look at the paper. Among those approaches, there are some methods and tools that are sometimes using by different approaches. But yeah, anyway, so here it's a table of the challenges that we identified and that David just presented, and the alternative tools, methods, and good practices that we suggest. So first, again, all of it are in the paper, but I'm going to focus just on some of it. The first one would be the process for gathering the information and processing the information. So for that, we suggest to rely on group model building and requisite variety. So group model building, it's a process from systems thinking and the principle of this process is to collectively to build a team and collectively define a scope, so that you can build a qualitative overview of the situation before, if necessary, building a quantitative overview, a specific view of the situation, like a dynamic model, and comparing scenarios through simulation. So this part could be the net impact methodology could be of use during those parts. And the requisite variety, so it's the principle of bringing the entire system into the room. So the idea is that the team that you build should be diverse and representative. so that when you build a qualitative overview of the situation, we're going to see what kind of shape it can take. But when you build a qualitative overview, you won't miss those uncertainties, because you'll have some people who will have different interests in different point of view. So you will build a more complete picture of the situation. Yeah, you will identify more sources of uncertainties, both qualitatively and quantitatively. And then when you compare scenarios, so the idea is not to compare just a reference scenario with a scenario where the solution is implemented, but comparing different scenarios in which we implement the solution differently. So using levels of action, design levels of action. And then when comparing those scenarios, you'll have different, let's say, variable of interest representing different kind of impacts, and you will have the opportunity of a debate around those impacts and a priority of these impacts. Yes, you can change the slide. I'm a bit rusty, I'm sorry. So yeah, the idea is to here recognize the importance of uncertainty and to adopt a problem-oriented approach to limit the risk of bias and misuse through this plurality of perspective. Then to qualitatively build an overview of the situation, we suggest the use of causal loop diagrams or influence diagrams that are like really likewise, but without the plus and minus. So here we illustrate what could have been a causal loop diagram around the vintage situation. It's a bit of a consequence tree with loops, as David explained. Here it's focused on the vintage solution because we are in a midway situation. So before even designing the vintage platform, we should have used the causal loop diagram to represent the whole textile industry situation and what are the problems, and that would have maybe inspired the design and implementation of the vintage solution, or not. We don't know, because we didn't do it before. So now this causal loop diagram, this one is focused on the different effects of vintage. So for instance, you can see here that the more clothes are sold on the platform, the more money is earned from sales by the sellers, not by vintage here, but by the sellers. And the more money can be reinvested in new clothes, because some of the users in vintage use vintage just to sell clothes so that they can buy other new clothes. So we are just here fueling the fast fashion vicious cycle. And then you have the impact, obviously, on the carbon emissions, the clothing related waste, but also the workers' conditions, because the more clothes are sold on the fast fashion market, the more they have to produce these clothes, and the more you have people in bad work conditions. I think you can go to the next step. Okay. Maybe you can, so can you go back to the previous slides? Yes, thank you. So maybe I can, because we have more time, I can comment another loop. Yes, thank you. So you can also see that the more clothes are on the platform, yes, I can't. So I'm going to explain the loop with the charities. Yeah, the more clothes you have on the platform, the less clothes are donated to charities. So that is a minus sign on the arrow. And if I have a lot of clothes donated to charities, I have a lot of budget and I have a lot of popularity. So when I am decreasing the number of clothes donated to charities, I am decreasing the budget, decreasing the popularity, and decreasing the donations because they are less visible. So the impact could be a decrease, obviously, in social solidarity actions, and that we can't easily quantify it, and we don't have any I think, interest in quantifying it. So that's why it's important to have such a qualitative overview of the situation before we get to go to the quantifiable things that are can have some interest in some situation, because we want to compare the different possible strategies, but we have to keep in mind the qualitative impacts and what we suggest here is to build this qualitative view before going to the numbers and the figures. And it's the opposite in the net impact method. Usually it goes as an afterthought in the end. So yes, this was a suggestion for a qualitative overview of the situation, and it can be a way to expose unquantifiable uncertainties, such as the social impact. And also it can be used to qualitatively identify levers for action. So I can say, okay, this arrow, this causality, I want to tackle it, and I want to build a design strategy to reduce the impact and to reduce this causality, for instance. You can go to the next slide. Yes. So regarding the quantitative modeling, we propose to draw inspiration from system dynamics that comes also from systems thinking, and to collectively build a model with a graphical interface so that it can be understood by the different stakeholders and modified open to, so that it can be open to criticism. So here it's an illustration of a consequential model based on the vintage study that we made in a tool that I developed as part of my thesis. So it's here in its specific, this specific part, it's quite the same effort as doing a net impact assessment, because we are using the same survey as Vinted did. But it's more open to criticism, and we have included rebound effects that weren't taken into account in the study. For instance, the compulsive buying, the fact that the sellers, they will use the money to buy brand new clothes on the fast fashion market. The results that it generated are significantly different from the value study. So we don't have more time for presenting the model, but we can discuss it during the questions or afterwards. And then, yes, so the dynamic modeling, the objective is to expose the quantifiable uncertainty. So we can change through the graphical interface and through the process of involving different stakeholders. They can change the hypothesis behind the model and see the difference. So take account for uncertainty, quantifiable uncertainty. It helps also it could help the stakeholder understand the dynamics behind the model. So the dynamics behind also the Vinted markets, in fact, the orders of magnitude and dynamics. And it can help identify and compare levers for action. So should I forbid clothes that are not really second-hand on the platform, or should I put a virtual currency into place so that people who sell clothes on the platform can't use this money to buy things outside the platform that are brand new? This kind of strategical decisions that we could compare and combine. So we are aware that these are, I'm actually talking like it works, but these are just a suggestion of tools and methods to complement the net impact methodologies. We illustrated it for the Vinted case study, but we didn't actually implement it in this case. During my thesis, I implemented it in another case study, but I can't say that it works. We have to conduct more research about it to know how to best combine these tools and what are the specific limitations. I think that's it. Yeah. So thank you very much for your attention, and sorry for the little bugs. I was a bit rusty on this presentation.
It was perfect, Laetitia. Yeah, we're happy.
We
I
are
think for
open
10
to
minutes, we're happy
questions.
to. Yeah.
You
Okay,
can
I
take
see a
questions.
question.
Was it questions? You can. We have time. It was a
Yeah.
really interesting presentation. Yeah. It's I just say a kind of a complex area and subject. I assume the decision maker you're referring to is a kind of political decision maker, not a decision maker in like Vinted. Is that, or is it both?
It's both, and it's even more. So we didn't present it, but in the paper we present a table of what we call decision situations. Maybe you have it somewhere. And because in the different methodologies, they talk about supporting decision in different situations, and they don't really
Okay.
clarify it. So we tried to clarify it, and we try to address different decision-making situation. But of course, the combination of tools and the way of implementing it will be different depending on the situation. But here, there is the consumer's decision of buying or not, the designer within the company of implementing a feature or not, and the strategical level of a company, investors, and even policymakers. Yes.
I guess there's something about the alignment of the decision makers' goals with the rest of the system, and Vinted may be all about actually, whilst they're talking about reducing impact, it's all about profit. Whereas the political decision maker, it's that in itself is complex. And then also communication, because communicating complex impact is really hard, and especially if it's a politician trying to do it. It's like, oh, it's fascinating, and I really like the look of your tool as well. I see someone's posted the link to it in the chat, so I'm going to have a play with it. So thank you very much. It's really good.
Yes, perfect. Because the someone posted a GitHub, so it's not the GitHub is I'm not sure the GitHub is publicly available right now, but the tool is available, and Samuel posted the link. Thank you.
And concerning decision, there is something in the discussion or limitation of the paper is that we don't address something that is very important is the decision that is related to citizen. The fact that also in net impact method, there is nothing about the collective action, but I think in those complex, with this complex view, we can also see how we can interact with the system through collective action, which also is something that I think is really needed right now.
Do you talk about timescales as well in your paper at all? So so complexity isn't just in my mind the interaction between all the various different actors and systems and processes. There's also when you see the consequence of whatever action you take. Is that something you examine? Or?
Yeah, in fact, so I think, for instance, the quantifiable, the quantification tools are more useful for short and medium term, maybe, and you have more qualitative actions that will be more long term. So you have in the paper I mentioned to Donella Meadows levels of leverage points for intervening in a system. So she's a system thinker. She was part of the Limit to Growth authors. And she gives some different categories of leverages, and yeah, we synthesize it in 4 categories. So you have the parameters, feedback loops, system structure, and mental models, and it's from the easiest and short term to the more difficult to change and the more long term. So you have to combine these different approaches to address the different timeframes.
Do you know? I think Arno suggested to see what they do at System Dynamic Society, but I think you know them, Laetitia.
Yeah, but in fact, I never interacted with them, so that's
Okay.
I'm gonna, yeah. Thank
Yes,
you.
yeah, it would be great to discuss with you because this is what we're trying to do using this system dynamic tools. And I have a question for you because as you mentioned, one of the difficulty when we do this kind of causal loop diagram is to be able to evaluate the different strength of causal loops to understand what in which way the system will go depending on how much we put effort on this loop or not. And then comes the other tools based on the stock and flows and kind of measurement. That's a level of I would say difficulty that is maybe higher than the CLD. And I wonder whether you try to go to that further step in terms in evaluation if you try to use a stock and flow measurement.
Yes. So regarding the Vinted case study, I worked with designers which were not employees of Vinted, just designers that were interested in the systemic approaches. And during the first workshop, they built collectively a kind of causal loop diagram. It was an influence diagram first, so just simplified without the plus and minus, because then when they get the thing about the plus and minus on the negative and positive arrows, they only think about this in this paradigm, and they don't go to the quantitative part. So first we build the influence diagrams, and then they had to comment each arrow, but it's really based on their understanding on the situation, not on real data, on their expertise, if so. And then during the second workshop, we worked on the dynamic model. So it's not exactly stock and flow. It's a bit different formalism because it was easier to implement in a for different reasons that I will not develop here. But and then this is really based on both the understanding in the causal loop diagram and the value study, or the huge value survey and the
survey.
answer of the people. So yeah. So for instance,
But the
in this, yeah, sorry.
no, go ahead.
So maybe the difference between what you would do, Arnaud, I'm not sure. Here, it's a quantitative representation that allows for simulation, but it's not directly translated from the causal loop diagram. It's really a new work based on this understanding where we focus on the quantifiable things. And in fact, the model is a consequential model that expose what a consequential study would do, but with a graphical interface and with some loops, because, for instance, when people decide to reinvest the money they earn from sale on the platform, it will feed the sales of the next month. I'm not sure I have the time of explaining the model right here.
No, but it's really interesting. I didn't know this tool. So, we use a Vensim that you may heard of, but Vensim is not an easy tool to play with. So I'm really interested about this one. I think, I'm gonna try to play with that. If you have a bit of time in the future, I'll be happy to understand how you do it.
I'm just writing my email address, so if you want to contact me, and to everybody, if you are interested in this topic and if you want to assist to my defense on the 12th of this December, just write me your email and I will post a link.
And maybe about the quantitative stuff, the quantitative way of seeing it, it's mainly as a way to understand the relative values. It's like the absolute value have not a lot of sense, and this is also why in the paper we have a graph and we didn't even put the values on the y-axis on purpose, because we want to see that it's a way to see trends, but not the absolute value. It's just a way to play with different variables and see how the trend is changing. We don't care about in most of the cases, if you think about the decision-making objective, do you really need the absolute values? And sometimes you need it just to claim the emission and say, look how much I avoided. But in most of the cases, if you just have the trend, or if you just have also a qualitative perspective on the compatibility of your solution with a transition scenario, this is more than enough to make decisions, right?
Yeah. In fact, what is interesting is that another case study where I really really implemented partially this methodology that we suggest. It was about an eco train, electric train in southwest of France, and the stakeholders involved in the project, they were really critical about the model at the end of it. So they were saying, oh, they were really acknowledging the fact that it's really uncertain. They were saying, okay, this we really have to explore it more, because we can't say that it's going to be this or that, but still we have this insight and this insight. So it was really interesting. That I think the key is implying people, and in fact, yes, the absolute definite figure at the end is not the important thing. But if I had brought just the model to them and not involved them in building the model, maybe they would have taken decisions like the model is the truth, So yeah.